The dusty parking lot of Murphy's Bar and Grill stretched out like a forgotten battlefield under the harsh Oklahoma sun. Staff Sergeant Emma Rodriguez stepped out of her beat-up Honda Civic, her combat boots crunching on the gravel. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, she was finally home in Millbrook, a town so small it barely had a main street. But home didn't feel the same anymore. Emma had left as Tommy Rodriguez's little sister, the girl who could throw a football farther than most boys and fix an engine blindfolded. She returned as a decorated soldier with scars that ran deeper than the thin white line across her left cheek. The army had shaped her into something fierce and unbreakable, but the people of Millbrook still saw her as that scrappy kid from the trailer park. The bell above Murphy's door chimed as she entered. Conversations stopped, eyes turned. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, others dismissive. Emma walked to the bar with measured steps, her military bearing impossible to hide even in civilian clothes. "Well, I'll be damned," came a voice from behind her. "Look what the cat dragged in." Emma turned to see Jake Morrison, a high school classmate who'd never left Millbrook. He was bigger now, his football muscle turned to fat, flanked by his usual crew: Rick Barnes, Pete Wilson, Danny Mitchell, and Tom Bradley. They'd been the popular kids once. Now they were just grown men who peaked in high school, spending their evenings reliving glory days over cheap beer. "Emma Rodriguez," Jake said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Heard you were playing soldier overseas. Must be nice, getting paid to travel the world while the rest of us work real jobs." Emma's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "It's Staff Sergeant Rodriguez now, Jake, and I wasn't playing anything." Rick Barnes laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the bar's ambient noise. "Staff Sergeant, listen to that, boys. Our little Emma thinks she's tough now because she got some fancy title." The bartender, an older man named Bill Murphy, slid a beer across the bar to Emma. His eyes held sympathy, but he stayed silent. In a town like Millbrook, you didn't pick fights with the Morrison crew unless you wanted trouble. 3 tours, Emma said quietly, taking a sip of her beer. "Kandahar, Helmand, and Kunar provinces. I was a sniper. 47 confirmed kills." The number hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, the 5 men were quiet. Then Pete Wilson, always the loudest of the group, broke into laughter. "A sniper, you," he wheezed. "Emma, honey, we all remember when you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn at the school carnival. You expect us to believe the army turned you into some kind of killer." "Maybe she counted prairie dogs," Danny Mitchell chimed in, earning chuckles from his friends. Emma set her beer down carefully. Her hands were steady, a habit learned from years of precision shooting. "I don't expect you to believe anything. I'm just here for a drink." But Jake wasn't done. He moved closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Emma's smaller frame. At 5'6" and 140 pounds, she looked fragile next to his 6'3", 250-pound frame. "You know what I think," Jake said, his breath reeking of beer and arrogance. "I think you spent 3 years cooking meals and filing paperwork, then came home with stories to make yourself feel important. I bet you never even saw combat." The bar had gone completely silent now. Even the jukebox seemed to hold its breath. Emma could feel every eye in the place watching, waiting to see how the conversation would unfold. She turned to face Jake fully, her dark eyes meeting his. "You have no idea what you're talking about, don't I?" Jake's voice rose. "See, the thing is, Emma, we all know who you really are. You're still just Jimmy Rodriguez's daughter from Elm Street Trailer Park. You're still the girl whose daddy ran off when she was 12, whose mama worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Putting on a uniform doesn't change that." Emma's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The mention of her father was a low blow, and Jake knew it. James Rodriguez had abandoned his family when gambling debts caught up with him, leaving Emma's mother, Maria, to raise 2 kids alone. It was a wound that had never fully healed. "At least I did something with my life," Emma said, her voice dangerously quiet. "At least I didn't spend 10 years getting drunk in the same bar, talking about the same high school football games." Jake's face darkened. His friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in mood. "You think you're better than us now? Is that it?" "I think I served my country while you served yourself another beer." The slap came without warning. Jake's massive hand caught Emma across the face, the sound echoing through the silent bar like a gunshot. Her head snapped to the side, but she didn't fall. She didn't even step back. Slowly, Emma turned her face back to Jake. A thin line of blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, but her eyes were steady and cold. "That was a mistake," she said. Jake laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now. "What are you going to do about it? Call for backup from your army buddies?" "They're not "Here, sweetheart, it's just you and us." Emma wiped the blood from her mouth with the back of her hand. The gesture was deliberate, controlled. Around the bar, patrons were reaching for their phones, but Emma raised a hand to stop them. "No," she said clearly. "No police. No backup. Just me." She looked at each of the 5 men in turn, memorizing their positions, their stances, their weaknesses. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught her to read people like maps, to spot threats before they fully formed. Jake was the biggest, but also the slowest. Rick was lean but favored his right side, probably an old sports injury. Pete was drunk and off balance. Danny was nervous, shifting his weight constantly. Tom was trying to blend into the background, hoping to avoid conflict altogether. "You want to know what I learned in the army?" Emma asked, her voice carrying to every corner of the bar. "I learned that size doesn't matter. Training does, discipline does. And respect, real respect, isn't given because you're the biggest guy in the room. It's earned." Jake took a step toward her, his fists raised. Big words for such a little girl. Emma stood her ground, her posture relaxed but ready. The bartender reached for the phone, but she shook her head again. 83 seconds, she said, so quietly that Jake had to lean in to hear her. "What?" Emma's eyes never left his face. "That's how long it took me to neutralize 5 Taliban fighters who ambushed my convoy outside Kandahar. They had AK-47s and RPGs. You have beer guts and bad attitudes." The silence stretched taut as a wire. Then Jake lunged forward, his massive fist aimed at Emma's head. But Emma Rodriguez wasn't the scared girl from the trailer park anymore. She was a United States Army Ranger, trained in combat by the best military in the world. And Jake Morrison was about to learn the difference between picking on a small-town girl and fighting a warrior. The fight began and ended before most people could blink. Jake's haymaker punch, telegraphed and clumsy, met empty air as Emma sidestepped with fluid grace. Her counterattack was immediate and precise, a sharp elbow to his solar plexus that doubled him over, followed by a knee to his face that straightened him back up. Blood exploded from his nose as he staggered backward into his friends. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from a back booth. Rick Barnes reacted first, throwing a wild punch that Emma caught at the wrist. She twisted his arm behind his back in one smooth motion, using his own momentum to drive him face first into the bar. The impact sent beer bottles crashing to the floor. Pete Wilson, drunk and stupid, grabbed a pool cue and swung it like a baseball bat. Emma ducked under the swing and swept his legs, sending him crashing into a table. The pool cue clattered across the floor as Pete groaned and clutched his ribs. Danny Mitchell tried to grab Emma from behind, but she sensed him coming. She threw her head back, connecting with his nose, then spun and drove her fist into his gut. He folded like a lawn chair. Tom Bradley, the smartest of the group, raised his hands and backed away. "I'm out," he said quickly. "I want no part of this." Emma nodded and let him retreat to the far corner of the bar. Smart man. Jake, blood streaming from his broken nose, charged again with a roar of rage. Emma waited until the last second, then stepped aside and grabbed his shirt, using his own weight and momentum to send him crashing through the front window. Glass exploded outward as Jake's massive form hit the sidewalk and rolled into the street. The entire confrontation had lasted exactly 83 seconds. 5 men, grown men who outweighed her by 50 pounds each, lay groaning on the floor and sidewalk. Emma stood in the center of the wreckage, barely breathing hard, her clothing slightly disheveled but otherwise unharmed. The bar erupted in cheers and applause, but Emma barely heard it. She was somewhere else, remembering another fight, another time when everything had gone wrong. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. 2 years earlier, Sergeant Emma Rodriguez lay prone on a rocky outcrop, her M24 sniper rifle steady against her shoulder. Through the scope, she could see the Taliban patrol moving through the valley below. 6 fighters armed with AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades. "Overwatch, this is Shadow 2, she whispered into her radio. "I have eyes on the package. 6 hostiles, approximately 800 meters southeast of the village. Copy. Shadow 2, you are cleared to engage. Protect the convoy at all costs." Below her squad was conducting a humanitarian mission, delivering medical supplies to a remote village. They were sitting ducks if the Taliban reached the high ground first. Emma's job was to make sure that didn't happen. She controlled her breathing, let her heart rate slow, and squeezed the trigger. The first Taliban fighter dropped instantly. The others scattered, looking for cover, but Emma was already tracking her next target. For more shots, for more kills. The 6th fighter tried to run, but there was nowhere to hide in the open desert. 5 confirmed kills in less than 2 minutes. Clean, precise, professional. But when Emma climbed down from her perch to rejoin her squad, she found them under attack from a different direction. A second Taliban patrol had flanked them while she was focused on the first group. Her squad leader, Staff Sergeant Mike Thompson, was pinned down behind their Humvee with 3 other soldiers. Emma's rifle was out of ammunition, and there was no time to reload. The Taliban fighters were closing in, their automatic weapons chattering. In 30 seconds, her friends would be dead. That's when Emma Rodriguez became something more than a sniper. She became a force of nature. She pulled her combat knife and moved like a ghost through the rocks and scrub brush. The first Taliban fighter never saw her coming. The blade slid between his ribs and into his heart before he could scream. The second turned just in time to see Emma's fist coming toward his neck snapped like a dry branch. The third fighter managed to get his weapon up, but Emma was already inside his guard. A quick strike to his throat crushed his windpipe. He dropped his rifle and clutched his neck, gasping for air that would never come. The fourth and fifth fighters tried to work together, flanking her from both sides. Emma grabbed a fallen AK-47 and spun it like a staff, catching one man in the temple with the stock and the other in the gut with the barrel. Both dropped unconscious. 83 seconds. 5 enemy combatants neutralized with her bare hands and improvised weapons. When the smoke cleared, Staff Sergeant Thompson stared at Emma with something approaching. Rodriguez, he said, his voice shaky, remind me never to arm wrestle you. Back in Murphy's bar, present day. Emma blinked, returning to the present. The memories were always there, just below the surface, waiting to surge up when adrenaline hit her system. Around her, the bar patrons were still talking excitedly about the fight, but Emma felt only emptiness. She'd come home hoping to find peace, to reconnect with the girl she'd been before the war changed her. Instead, she'd found the same bullies she'd left behind, and she'd responded the only way she knew how, with violence. Bill Murphy approached cautiously, a bar towel in his hands. Emma, you okay? She nodded, though it wasn't entirely true. Sorry about the window, Bill. I'll pay for the damage. Don't worry about it, he said quietly. Jake Morrison's had that coming for years. Most folks around here will thank you for what you just did. Emma looked around the bar, seeing the faces of people she'd grown up with. Some looked impressed, others frightened. A few seemed to be seeing her clearly for the first time. The thing is, she said, her voice carrying in the sudden quiet, I didn't come home to fight. I came home to heal, to find some peace after 3 tours in hell. But it seems like some people can't let others grow, can't accept that someone might be more than they remember. She walked to the broken window and looked out at Jake Morrison, who was sitting on the curb holding his broken nose and glaring at her with pure hatred. I'm not the same person who left here 4 years ago, Emma continued. The army taught me to be strong, to fight, to protect people who can't protect themselves, but it also taught me when to walk away. She turned back to the bar, her decision made. I'm going to finish my beer, pay my tab, and leave. And I'm not coming back to Murphy's. Not because I'm afraid, but because I'm better than this. We all should be. Emma returned to her seat at the bar and took a long sip of her beer. Around her, conversations gradually resumed, but she could feel the weight of their stares, their whispered comments. The girl from the trailer park had become a warrior, and Millbrook didn't know what to do with that transformation. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called the police despite her request not to. Emma sighed and finished her beer. Her peaceful homecoming was about to become a lot more complicated. But as she sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of the confrontation and the ghosts of her past, Emma Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to run anymore, wasn't going to hide from who she'd become or apologize for her strength. Millbrook was about to learn what happened when you pushed a warrior too far. The police station in Millbrook was a small, single-story building that looked more like an insurance office than a law enforcement facility. Sheriff Robert Hayes, a man who'd held the job for 23 years without ever having to deal with anything more serious than drunk driving or domestic disputes, stared across his desk at Emma Rodriguez with a mixture of confusion and concern. 5 men. Emma, he said, shaking his head. He put 5 men in the hospital. They'll live, Emma replied calmly. She sat straight in the uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands folded in her lap. Jake has a broken nose and some bruised ribs. Rick has a concussion. Pete has 3 cracked ribs. Danny has a deviated septum. None of them have life-threatening injuries. Sheriff Hayes rubbed his temples. He'd known Emma since she was a kid, had even hired her to help with filing during summer breaks when money was tight at home. The transformation was startling. The scared, skinny girl had become this composed, dangerous woman who spoke about broken bones like a medical examiner. "That's not the point," he said. "You can't just self-defense," Emma interrupted. "Jake Morrison struck me first. There are 37 witnesses who can testify to that fact. I responded with appropriate force to neutralize the threat." Appropriate force. Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Emma, you threw a 250-pound man through a window. He weighed 247, actually. And I didn't throw him. I redirected his momentum. If I'd thrown him, he'd be in surgery right now instead of getting his nose reset." But Sheriff stared at her for a long moment. Outside, he could hear the sounds of Millbrook's evening rush hour, all 6 cars of it, passing by on Main Street. This was supposed to be a simple town with simple problems. Emma Rodriguez was anything but simple. "The Morrison family is pressing charges," he said finally. "Assault and battery, destruction of property, disturbing the peace. Jake's father is talking about getting a lawyer from Oklahoma City." Emma nodded as if she'd expected this. "And what charges are being filed against Jake for assaulting me first?" Hayes looked uncomfortable. "Now, Emma, you know how these things work. The Morrisons have been in this town for 4 generations. Jake's father owns the car dealership, sponsors the high school football team. People look up to that family. So, because they have money and influence, they get to assault veterans without consequences. That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying?" Sheriff Hayes sighed. He'd been dreading this conversation since the moment he'd arrived at Murphy's bar and seen the aftermath of the fight. Emma Rodriguez had always been a fighter, even as a kid, but this was different. This was professional, controlled violence that spoke of training and experience he couldn't begin to understand. "Look," he said, trying to find the right words, "maybe we can work something out. If you apologize to Jake and his family, maybe pay for the medical bills and the damage to Murphy's whim, might be able to make this go away quietly." Emma's eyes went cold. "Apologize? For defending myself? For escalating the situation? For using excessive force? Emma, I've known you since you were 10 years old. Your mother is good people, and I respect your service to this country. But you can't come back here thinking military rules apply to civilian life. Military rules." Emma stood up slowly, her movements controlled but radiating barely contained fury. "Let me tell you about military rules, Sheriff. Military rules say you protect the innocent. Military rules say you stand up to bullies. Military rules say you don't back down when someone assaults you just because they have more money or influence." "This isn't Afghanistan, Emma, no, it's not," she agreed. "In Afghanistan, when someone attacked me, I knew they were the enemy. Here, I'm finding out that some of my own neighbors are willing to look the other way when a veteran gets assaulted. As long as the right family is doing the assaulting." Hayes stood up as well, his patience wearing thin. "Damn it. Emma, I'm trying to help you here. The Morrison family has influence in this town. They can make your life hell if they want to. Is your pride worth that?" Emma looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the man who'd given her summer work as a teenager, but another person willing to compromise justice for convenience. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." "Then you're a fool." "Maybe, but I'm a fool who served 3 tours in combat zones, who earned the Bronze Star and Purple Heart, who put her life on the line for this country and everyone in it, including the Morrison family. And I'll be damned if I'm going to apologize for defending myself against a drunk bully just because his daddy owns a car lot." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Hayes realized he was dealing with someone who'd seen and done things that put a bar fight into perspective. Emma Rodriguez wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to make this easy for anyone. "Have it your way," he said finally. "But don't say I didn't warn you." Emma headed for the door, then paused. "Sheriff, can I ask you something? What if it had been your daughter in that bar, and Jake Morrison had slapped her the way he slapped me? What would you have done?" Hayes opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. "That's different," he said weakly. "How? Because my daughter isn't trained to kill people with her bare hands." Emma nodded slowly. "You're right. Your daughter probably would have ended up in the hospital instead of the morgue if she'd tried to defend herself against 5 men. I ended up walking away without a scratch. The training you're afraid of is exactly what kept me alive and kept them from getting seriously hurt." She opened the door and stepped into the evening air. "I'll be at my mother's house if anyone needs me, but Sheriff, the next time someone assaults me, I won't go as easy on them. That's not a threat, it's a promise." As Emma walked down Main Street toward her mother's house, she could feel the weight of stairs from every window, every passing car. Word traveled fast in a small town, and by now everyone knew about the fight at Murphy's. Some of those stares held curiosity, others, fear. A few held something that might have been respect. Emma's mother, Maria Rodriguez, was waiting on the front porch of their small house when Emma arrived. At 52, Maria looked older than her years, worn down by decades of hard work and worry. But her eyes were still fierce, still proud. "Mia," she said, pulling Emma into a tight hug. "I heard what happened. Are you hurt?" "No, Mama, I'm fine." Maria held her at arm's length, studying her daughter's face. "And the others, they'll live." Maria nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Good. Jake Morrison has had that coming since high school, his father too, for that matter." Emma was surprised. "You're not upset?" "Upset, Mia. I'm proud of you. You came home a warrior, and you acted like one. The Morrison family thinks they own this town, thinks they can treat people however they want because they have money. It's about time someone showed them different." They sat together on the porch swing, watching the sun set over Millbrook's modest skyline. In the distance, Emma could see the lights of Murphy's bar, where maintenance crews were installing a new window. "What happens now?" Maria asked. Emma was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. Sheriff Hayes says they want to press charges. The whole town is going to take sides. It's going to get ugly." "Let it get ugly," Maria said firmly. "You did nothing wrong, Emma. You defended yourself against a man who attacked you. If this town can't see that, if they're willing to side with bullies because of money and influence, then maybe it's time they learned what real strength looks like." Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder, feeling some of the tension leave her body. "I just wanted to come home and be normal again." "You are normal, Mia. You're just normal for a soldier, not normal for a small-town girl, and that's exactly what this place needs." As night fell over Millbrook, Emma Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to run, wasn't going to apologize, wasn't going to let the Morrison family intimidate her into silence. She was going to stay and fight, not with her fists this time, but with something far more dangerous: the truth. The Millbrook Community Center hadn't seen this much activity since the high school basketball team made it to the state championships in 1987. Tonight, it was packed with nearly 300 people, almost a third of the town's population, all drawn by the promise of drama and the chance to pick sides in what had become the most talked about incident in years. Emma Rodriguez sat in the front row, flanked by her mother and a small group of supporters that had grown over the past week. To her left sat Bill Murphy, who'd spoken out publicly about Jake Morrison's history of bar fights and intimidation. Next to him was Dr. Patricia Williams, the town's only female physician who'd treated Emma's mother during her cancer scare 2 years earlier. A handful of other veterans occupied the rest of the row, men and women who understood what Emma had been through even if they hadn't served in combat themselves. Across the aisle, the Morrison family commanded a much larger section. Jake sat, with his arm in a sling that Emma suspected was more for show than necessity, his broken nose hidden behind a large bandage. His father, Richard Morrison, owned half the businesses in town and looked like a man accustomed to getting his way. Behind them sat their supporters, employees, business partners, and longtime residents who believed in the natural order of things. Mayor Catherine Brennan, a nervous woman in her 60s who'd never had to deal with anything more controversial than the annual Christmas tree lighting, stood at the podium trying to restore order to the increasingly hostile crowd. "This is not a trial," she announced, her voice barely audible over the murmur of conversations. "This is a community meeting to discuss the recent incident at Murphy's bar and determine how we, as a town, should move forward. We move forward by arresting that woman for assault." Richard Morrison's voice boomed from the back of the room. "My son is a victim here, and I won't stand for this travesty of justice." Applause erupted from his section, but it was matched by boos and catcalls from Emma's supporters. Mayor Brennan banged her gavel frantically, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Mr. Morrison, please," she said. "Everyone will have a chance to speak. Let's maintain some decorum." But decorum was the last thing on anyone's mind. This wasn't really about a bar fight anymore. It was about power, influence, and the changing nature of their small town. Emma Rodriguez represented something new and unsettling, a challenge to the established order that had kept the Morrison family at the top of Millbrook's social hierarchy for generations. Dr. Williams stood up, her voice cutting through the noise. "I'd like to say something, if I may." The room gradually quieted. Dr. Williams was respected by everyone, regardless of which side they were on. She'd delivered half the babies in town and treated everyone from the richest businessman to the Poorest farm worker with the same level of care. I've been practicing medicine in this town for 23 years, she began. In that time, I've treated more than a dozen people who've been assaulted by Jake Morrison. Bar fights, road rage, incidents, domestic violence calls. Always the same pattern. Jake gets drunk, Jake gets angry, Jake hurts someone, and every time, his father's money and influence make the problem go away. Richard Morrison shot to his feet. That's a damned lie, is it? Dr. Williams pulled out a manila folder. Because I have medical records right here that tell a different story. Beth Carver, 2018, broken ribs after Jake threw her down the stairs during an argument. Tommy Preston, 2019, fractured jaw after Jake attacked him outside the grocery store. Lisa Martinez, 2020, concussion and black eye. After those records are confidential. Richard Morrison's face was turning red. You have no right to share them. Actually, I do, Dr. Williams replied calmly. All 3 victims signed releases this morning, along with 4 others. They're all here tonight, ready to tell their stories. The question is, does this town want to hear them? Emma looked around the room, seeing the faces of people she'd grown up with. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious. A few were clearly angry that their dirty laundry was being aired in public. But in the back, she spotted Beth Carver, a woman she remembered from high school who'd always been quiet and shy. Beth met Emma's eyes and nodded, her jaw set with determination. Mayor Brennan looked like she wanted to disappear. Dr. Williams, I'm not sure this is the appropriate forum for, with respect. Madam Mayor, came a new voice from the back of the room. I think it's exactly the appropriate forum. Everyone turned to see a tall, distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit walking down the center aisle. Emma didn't recognize him, but from the way Richard Morrison's face went pale, she could guess who he was. Ladies and gentlemen, the man said, reaching the front of the room, my name is David Park, and I'm an investigative journalist with the Oklahoma City Tribune. I've spent the past week looking into the Morrison family's history in this town, and what I've found is quite interesting. The room erupted again, but this time the noise was different. Shocked gasps, angry shouts, and the scraping of chairs as people leaned forward to hear better. Richard Morrison looked like he'd seen a ghost. You have no business here, Morrison shouted. This is a private town meeting. Actually, it's a public meeting, Park replied smoothly. And the story I'm working on is definitely a matter of public interest. It's about corruption, abuse of power, and a pattern of violence that's been covered up for years by money and influence. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't contacted any journalists, hadn't sought publicity for what had happened. Someone else had made that call, and she had a feeling her life was about to get a lot more complicated. Park opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. Over the past 15 years, the Morrison family has paid out more than $400,000 in settlements to keep assault victims quiet. Police reports have been buried, charges have been dropped, and witnesses have been intimidated into silence. All to protect the reputation of Jake Morrison and, by extension, his father's business interests. The silence in the room was deafening. Even Jake Morrison, who'd been posturing and playing the victim all week, looked stunned by the revelation. That's not all, Park continued. I've also uncovered evidence of tax evasion, voter fraud, and intimidation of city council members who opposed Morrison business interests. This story is going to print whether Mr. Morrison likes it or not. Richard Morrison stood up, his face twisted with rage. You son of a bitch. I'll sue you and your newspaper into bankruptcy. With what money? Park asked mildly. Because according to the IRS agents I spoke with yesterday, your assets are about to be frozen pending a federal investigation. Emma watched in amazement as the Morrison empire began to crumble in real time. All around her, people were whispering, pointing, taking pictures with their phones. The story was already spreading beyond the walls of the community center, racing through social media and local news networks. But then Jake Morrison stood up, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. This is all because of her, he screamed, pointing directly at Emma. None of this would have happened if that bitch hadn't come back here thinking she was some kind of hero. The word hung in the air like a slap. Emma felt the familiar cold rage building in her chest, the same feeling she'd had in combat when everything slowed down and became crystal clear. She stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. The entire room focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond. You're right, Jake, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silence. None of this would have happened if I hadn't come home. Your victims would still be suffering in silence. Your father would still be buying his way out of consequences. and you would still be terrorizing this town with your fists and your family's money. She took a step toward him, and Jake instinctively backed away. But I did come home. And unlike the people you've hurt before, I'm not afraid of you. I'm not impressed by your father's money. And I'm sure as hell not going to apologize for defending myself against a coward who hits women. Emma looked around the room, meeting the eyes of everyone present. I spent 3 years fighting for this country's freedom. I'm not about to let a small-town bully take mine away. The applause started slowly, just a few people clapping, but it built quickly, growing into a thunderous ovation that shook the windows of the community center. Emma Rodriguez, the girl from the trailer park who'd become a warrior, had finally found her battlefield, and she was winning. 6 months later, Emma Rodriguez stood on the steps of the newly renovated Millbrook Community Center, watching as the morning sun painted the small town in shades of gold and amber. The changes were subtle but unmistakable: fresh paint on several buildings, new businesses opening where Morrison-owned properties had once stood empty, and most importantly, a sense of hope that hadn't existed in years. The federal investigation had moved swiftly once David Park's story broke. Richard Morrison was now serving 18 months in federal prison for tax evasion and election fraud. Jake Morrison had pled guilty to multiple assault charges and was completing court-ordered anger management and community service. The family's business empire had been dismantled, their properties sold to pay restitution to victims and back taxes. But the real change in Millbrook went deeper than just the fall of one corrupt family. Emma's stand that night at Murphy's Bar had inspired others to find their own courage, to speak up against injustice, to demand better from their community and themselves. "Ready for this?" asked Dr. Patricia Williams, joining Emma on the steps. She was wearing her best dress and carrying a folder of prepared remarks. Emma nodded, straightening the crisp uniform she'd chosen for today's ceremony. After 6 months of dealing with lawyers, journalists, and federal investigators, she'd made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. The community center was packed again, but this time the mood was celebratory rather than confrontational. Mayor Brennan, who'd found her spine during the Morrison investigation and was now running unopposed for re-election, took the podium with confidence she'd never shown before. "Friends and neighbors," she began, "we're here today to honor someone who reminded us all what courage looks like. 6 months ago, Staff Sergeant Emma Rodriguez returned home from 3 tours of duty.